You know, the very first recordings for this project, it wasn't even known as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band at that point. The band came into the studio to record their next masterpiece. At the top of the list were 3 songs. One was John's magnificent Starwberry Fields Forever, as well as 2 of Paul's songs, Penny Lane and When I'm 64. Of course, the very first song they would set to work on was John's magnificent Starwberry Fields Forever. So John Lennon even brings in a new toy, a brand new instrument and a marvel of technology at the time, the hallowed mellotron. Later, when the Beatles actually added Moog synthesizer to Abbey Road, it was merely a flavor they would use for this recording. Other bands would take this instrument and identify themselves with it. But to the Beatles, their palette wide, it was something to be investigated. Now, the mellotron basically came with 3 banks of taped, recorded music. And depending on what key you hit, it would play the note of that instrument. A prelude to modern synthesizers, certainly. It also, like a lot of Casio keyboards from the late 60s through the early 80s, came with a collection of pre-played little samba pieces, a brass section with a Jimmy Durante, yeah, at the end, and even a rather serious recording of a flamenco guitar. The very recording he would use on the continuing story of Bungalow Bill on the White Album a short time later. But it was Paul who would look at the instrument and see it as a possible piece of orchestration for this completely new and wonderful song. You see, with the mellotron, you had 3 choices. You could choose either strings, flute, or choir. Paul latched on the idea of flute, and this is where he developed the intro of Starwberry Fields Forever. For the distinctive drum sound for the song, Ringo dampened his drums with towels. Extra close miking on those drums provided this wonderful, powerful, muffled sound. Okay, but the work didn't stop there. As a matter of fact, it had barely begun. Now, with the Beatles recording the basic tracks, Paul on the mellotron, and everyone assigned to their post, you would have thought that would have been a complete song. And indeed, it had its charms. So where would they take this recording next? Now, John had been listening to the mix of Starwberry Fields Forever for a while now, and he came into the studio one day complaining that he wanted it to sound heavier. Now, with John Lennon, you usually got requests like, I want my voice to sound like the color yellow. And he was being almost as vague this time. It was George Martin, by the way, who suggested adding some orchestra to really give it a power. But John, quite uncharacteristically, I might add, right away even requested the specific instruments that he wanted in the orchestra on the song. So while there is a truth that John could be vague in his descriptions of what he wanted in his song, often leaving it up to Paul to translate Lennon-ese to Martinese. But this time he articulated himself well, and George Martin got to work. Now here's why we're taking an entire video on this one song, and that's the fact that Starwberry Fields Forever received more recording time, more energy put in, more changes into that song than any other John Lennon song ever recorded with the Beatles, including his magnificent A Day in a Life. After they recorded the orchestra that John wanted, he listened to it, he was happy with it, but then a few days passed. And that's when he came into the studio telling George Martin that, yeah, that's okay, but you know, I really like the beginning of the first one we did. And being non-technical John, he said, can't we just marry up the 2 pieces? The only problem was John evidently wasn't paying attention to the keys they were recorded in. You see, the 2 versions were a semitone apart. Not only that, they were also at different tempos. George Martin tried to explain this to John, with John just saying, you can fix it, and walking out of the studio, leaving the dirty job to George Martin and his team to figure out. Now, this is where Geoff Emerick and George Martin started talking. One of them brought up the fact that, they were recorded at different tempos, but they're not that far off. And as for the semitone, if we adjusted the tempo, maybe that would make up for the semitone. So they would have to join these two tapes. The only problem with joining these two tapes with your average 45-degree cut that you would normally do in editing is that would present a far too jarring event in the recording. The listener would hear the change not only in tempo, but in tone as well. So Geoff Emerick said he did one of the shallowest slicing jobs he ever did with tape. Instead of a 45-degree cut, we get this very long cut. Basically, a crossfade, artistically cut by the man, then played for John. John listened to it and asked Geoff, after the transition had occurred, "Has it happened yet?" With Geoff Emerick smiling at John saying, "Yes, it has." John was elated. Now we had this very beautiful, simple intro to the song, as well as this most powerful, magnificent ending of the song. Envisioned by John, translated by George Martin, and done by Geoff Emerick. This is what I call the Beatle machine, with all four Beatles even taking up the job of percussion to add minutiae to this wonderful song. The end result was something that pop music had never heard. The relentless chase of sound, the pursuit of perfection, and just a touch of genius from the writer himself, along with an equally great song provided by Paul, Penny Lane. The Beatles would put out their double A side, and in England, it went to number 2. They were beat out by Engelbert Humperdinck, but in the States, straight to number 1, of course. But this would take these 2 tracks off Sgt. Pepper, and to tell you the truth, I have my own personal Sgt. Pepper playlist. In that playlist is Sgt. Pepper with the addition of Starwberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. To me, this is the album that should have been presented to us, and this is how I listen to them. Of course, Paul gets a bump on that playlist as well as John, but with the addition of Starwberry Fields Forever, I just feel that Sgt. Pepper would have transcended even higher than it is in our minds today. The Beatles had an unwritten rule. The word no was never used while attempting to record their music. They wouldn't have tolerated it. And fortunately for them, they had men on the team who were not only willing to do the job, but quite capable.